had been going to the pool religiously 3 times a week as part of a post-pandemic fitness campaign. On this particular day, I was in the female changing room getting ready for a swim with a few friends. There were 4 of us there, plus an elderly woman I hadn't seen before, when a strange sound began to echo from outside. It was the sound of a scuffle, loud bangs, and indecipherable shouts coming from the hallway. Suddenly, a man came thundering into the room, dressed in filthy blue shorts and a stained, sleeveless shirt. His hair was wild, his skin was blotchy and flaky, and his eyes were absolutely crazed. But the most terrifying part was the massive, wicked-looking machete he held in his sweaty palms. He let out a guttural animal roar and began charging directly at me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and fell back against the lockers as he thundered past. Almost immediately, a gang of armed police officers burst in, chasing the man and yelling for him to freeze. The man shoved the elderly woman toward the cops as he fled into the pool area. We stood there shell-shocked as screams, and then a single gunshot erupted from the pool area. Eventually, a cop returned to tell us it was safe, and we left the gym without ever getting in the water. As we followed the officer, I saw the man being roughly escorted into a patrol car. It turns out he had been threatening people on the street before running into the gym to escape the police. Since that day, I never go anywhere without my own protection, because you never know who might burst in. I recently saw a man who looked identical to him mopping a floor at a local restaurant, and the memory came flooding back. I will never forget that face as long as I live. It was a clear reminder that safety is often just an illusion. That incident changed the way I look at every public space I enter. The police later confirmed he was likely under the influence of bath salts during the attack. Thankfully, the gunshot I heard was a warning shot, and no one in the pool area was hurt. But the elderly lady he shoved never came back to that gym again. Those of us who were there that day are still treated like celebrities at the gym. Even 50 years later, some stories never truly leave you. Public pools are supposed to be places of relaxation and community, but they can quickly become a maze with no easy exit when danger strikes. I can still hear the sound of his heavy boots smashing against the tiles. The image of that rusted blade stays etched in my mind. Every time I hear a loud bang in public, I immediately look for the nearest exit. Sometimes the ghosts of our past are people we only met for a few seconds. I'm just grateful that I lived to tell the story. It makes you appreciate the boring, normal days so much more. But I still triple-check the locks on my doors every single night, because the world can change in the blink of an eye, and predators don't always look like monsters until they are right in front of you. That gym session was my last one for a very long time. I wonder if the other women in that room feel the same way I do. The adrenaline from that day didn't fade for weeks. This was my true nightmare at the swimming pool. I am 61 years old now, but the memories of my childhood remain vivid. It all began when I was just 12, and my friend Clarky was 11. We met in the infants during our first year at a small suburban primary school. From that day on, after I found him playing with action figures, we were inseparable. We were just normal, regular lads who became the popular kids in our small world. We were always up to something, getting into the kind of trouble adults found charming. I was always more of the leader, while Clarky was content to be the follower. We were partners in crime, and we had no reservations about moving to the big school. Christ on a cracker. What naive little lads we were to think things wouldn't change. In the UK system, you shift straight from primary to secondary school at age 11. Suddenly, we were kings no more, but tiny squirts surrounded by hulking teenagers. We walked up that driveway like royalty and crawled out as broken wrecks. The transition was extreme, and to this day I believe it was actively damaging. We assumed we would be in the same classes, but the school intentionally split us up. Clarky was placed in Blue House and I was in Red, meaning we never shared a class. We only saw each other at break and lunch, and even then, things felt different. We became deeply and painfully unpopular targets for anyone looking for trouble. Separated for most of the day, we became beacons for the local bullies. There was a group of Year 9 boys we called the Cocks behind their backs. Jake was a big, lumbering oaf who was surprisingly creative with his insults. Jonah was unremarkable except for the cruel twinkle that always sat in his eyes. Jonah had a tongue that could dish out insults as sharp as any physical punch. They would do both, alternating between verbal abuse and physical strikes. Jake and Jonah remained a constant threat, always needing to needle us. They would kick the backs of our shoes or pour glue into our school bags. Once, they even went as far as cutting my necktie during a break. Every shove on the stairs was accompanied by their malevolent smiles. They found us multiple times each day, dishing out unusual forms of punishment. I never understood why our existence seemed to disgust them so deeply. Our first term from September through Christmas was an absolute hell. I still wonder why our parents never noticed the dark bags under our eyes. We became quiet and withdrawn, but we never considered telling anyone. Back then, dobbing someone in was considered a fate worse than death. Then the summer term arrived and we were introduced to the school pool. Swimming was on the schedule, and for once there was rejoicing in the room. I found Clarky waiting in the queue outside the changing rooms for the first time. The lessons were split by gender, which finally allowed us to be in a class together. It was the last class of the day on a Monday, and we decided to linger behind. As victims of bullying, we had learned to wait until everyone else had left. Our teacher had even left us the keys to lock up when we were finished. Clarky's eyes lit up as I jokingly suggested we go back into the pool. We didn't consider the danger of playing in the water unsupervised. We jumped in, the echoes of our laughter filling the massive empty room. But the laughter died instantly when the heavy doors creaked open once again. There, standing at the edge, were Jonah and Jake watching us with those same cruel smiles. The cruel smiles on Jonah and Jake's faces seemed to freeze the heavily chlorinated air. We were trapped in the deep end, treading water with no easy way out. My best friend Leo paddled nervously beside me. The acoustics of the indoor pool magnified their harsh laughter echoing from the tiled walls. I glanced toward the locker room doors, praying for a teacher to appear. But the vast, echoing natatorium was completely empty except for the four of us. Jonah stepped closer to the edge, his wet sneakers squeaking sharply against the tiles. He held a heavy fiberglass kickboard in his right hand. Jake mirrored his movements, deliberately blocking the only ladder to our left. The water lapped gently against the gutters, mocking the rising panic in my chest. "Just swim to the other side," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. I knew that was impossible. Jonah raised the kickboard, pointing it directly at Leo like a weapon. "Let's see how long the little squirt can hold his breath," Jonah sneered. Before I could shout, Jake lunged forward and shoved Leo hard on the shoulders. Leo went under, a spray of cold water hitting my face. I dove under the surface, opening my stinging eyes to find him. He bobbed back up, gasping and coughing violently. "Leave us alone," I yelled, my voice cracking humiliatingly. Jake laughed, a hollow sound that bounced off the high ceiling. "You have to stay under for 30 seconds if you want us to leave," Jonah demanded. It was an insane dare. But Leo, desperate to end the torment, took a deep breath. He slipped beneath the rippling blue surface. I watched his distorted shape through the water, counting the agonizing seconds. 1, 2, 3, the seconds stretched into an eternity. At 10 seconds, Leo tried to surface. Jonah stepped forward and slammed the kickboard down on the water, right over Leo's head. The dull thud echoed as Leo was forced back down into the murky depths. I lunged at Jonah's legs, trying to pull him into the water. A swift kick from Jake sent me reeling backward into the deep end. I swallowed a mouthful of heavily chlorinated water, choking and spluttering. Through my blurred vision, I saw Leo thrashing wildly below the surface. His movements were becoming erratic and uncoordinated. The bubbles escaping his mouth were growing fewer and further between. "Stop it, you're killing him," I screamed, thrashing toward the edge. Jonah just stood there, holding the board down with chilling indifference. Suddenly, Leo's thrashing stopped entirely. His body went limp, drifting downward like a discarded rag doll. The cruel smiles slowly vanished from the bullies' faces as they realized what they had done. Jake backed away from the pool edge, his hands trembling violently. Jonah dropped the kickboard, the plastic clattering loudly against the tiles. I dove straight down, my fingers stretching desperately toward my motionless friend. But as I grabbed his cold wrist, a heavy, metallic slam echoed from the locker room doors behind us. Through the distorted water surface, I saw a tall, unfamiliar shadow stepping out onto the pool deck. I broke the water's surface, gasping desperately for air as the dark shadow standing on the pool deck slowly materialized into a recognizable, hulking figure. The familiar, brightly lit tiled walls of the municipal pool seemed to warp and melt away, replaced instantly by the oppressive, wood-paneled walls of my childhood charter school in a sudden flood of terrifying memories. That looming shadow belonged to Dom, the adult son of the bizarre and secretive family who ran the secluded academy I was forced to attend. The charter school itself was housed in a sprawling, decaying Victorian mansion that sat atop a lonely hill, a place that always smelled faintly of harsh chlorine and rotting old paper. I was only 11 years old when my ambitious parents enrolled me in that isolated institution, completely unaware of the bizarre, dangerous reality hidden behind its prestigious wrought-iron gates. The headmaster and his frail wife were deeply eccentric recluses who managed the academy with an iron fist, yet they rarely spoke to the students outside of strictly regimented, terrifyingly silent lessons. But it was always their adult son, a hulking man named Dom, who cast the darkest and most terrifying shadow over the entire sprawling estate. Dom was a massive, intimidating man in his late 20s who roamed the dark halls like a restless ghost, always clad in stained, oversized gray tracksuits that rustled aggressively whenever he walked. He possessed no official teaching role or custodial title at the school, yet he constantly prowled the dimly lit corridors with a chilling sense of absolute, unquestioned authority. His heavy steel-toed work boots thumped ominously against the creaky hardwood floors of the mansion, creating an echoing rhythm that made every student freeze in their tracks in sheer terror. He had a profoundly unsettling habit of standing completely still in the dark corners of the grand dining hall, staring at us with dead, unblinking eyes as we ate our meals in hushed silence. The sprawling Victorian mansion possessed its own private, indoor swimming pool tucked away in the damp, subterranean depths of the old stone basement. This terrifying pool area was essentially a concrete cavern, illuminated only by rows of flickering, green-tinted fluorescent tubes that buzzed incessantly like dying insects trapped in a jar. Physical education at the strict academy consisted solely of swimming endless laps in that freezing, murky water, while the oppressive silence of the basement weighed down heavily on our young shoulders. We all absolutely hated those mandatory swimming lessons, mostly because Dom somehow always insisted on supervising them entirely alone, actively dismissing any other faculty members who tried to enter the basement. He would sit rigidly on a rusted metal folding chair at the deep end of the pool, endlessly twirling a silver whistle around his thick, hairy fingers while we shivered violently in the cold water. Even now, decades later, I can distinctly remember the horrifying way his heavy, predatory gaze tracked my every desperate swimming stroke through the heavy, toxic chlorinated haze hanging over the pool. On this particular rain-swept Tuesday afternoon, I found myself as the very last student left behind in the desolate locker room after a particularly grueling hour of mandatory swimming laps. The other boys had dressed with frantic, panic speed, incredibly eager to escape the subterranean chill and Dom's relentless, watchful eyes before the final afternoon bell rang. My heavily rusted locker combination dial had completely jammed during my rush, leaving me struggling with the freezing cold metal as the comforting echo of my classmates' departing footsteps faded away into nothingness. A profound, suffocating silence immediately descended upon the damp, dimly lit, changing area, making me acutely aware of every single shaky breath I took in the humid air. Suddenly, the heavy steel door connecting the humid pool deck directly to the locker room groaned open with a shrieking metallic scrape that made the blood in my veins run ice cold. The unmistakable rhythmic, dragging squeak of Dom's heavy rubber-soled shoes began echoing menacingly off the wet ceramic tiles, slowly growing louder and closer with every deliberate, heavy step. I instantly ducked down low behind a long row of severely dented green lockers, pressing my bare back against the freezing metal as my heart hammered violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. Peering cautiously through the narrow, rusted ventilation slits in the locker door, I watched his massive, shadowy frame completely block the only exit from the subterranean concrete room. He wasn't blowing his silver whistle or shouting authoritative commands like he usually did when he wanted the terrified students to hurry up and quickly vacate the premises. Instead, he was muttering incomprehensible, guttural syllables under his breath, his thick, hairy hands fidgeting nervously with the deep pockets of his heavily stained gray tracksuit jacket. I realized with a sickening, paralyzing jolt of pure visceral terror that he had deliberately waited out there in the shadows until every single other student was gone before finally entering the room. The old boys' locker room was a terrifying dead end, an inescapable concrete box with absolutely no windows and only that one heavy steel door that his massive body was currently blocking. I slowly and carefully began backing away from the exposed end of the locker aisle, stepping with agonizing precision to actively avoid splashing any of the numerous deep puddles of water pooled on the floor. Despite my absolute best efforts at stealth, my bare, wet feet made soft, damp, slapping sounds against the cold ceramic tiles that seemed deafeningly loud in the dead, heavy silence of the underground room. Dom abruptly stopped dead in his tracks right in the center of the room, his massive, heavy head tilting slightly to the side as if straining to listen to the faint, betraying sound of my retreat. He slowly and deliberately turned his entire massive body toward the dark back corner where I was desperately trying to conceal my shivering frame behind the final darkest row of lockers. A sickening, twisted smile stretched across his pale, sweating face as he reached deep into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy antique iron key that caught the flickering green fluorescent light. With deliberate, agonizing slowness that felt like intended psychological torture, he inserted the heavy key into the lock of the main exit door and slowly turned it with a loud, grating metallic click. The heavy, resonant metallic clunk of the deadbolt sliding firmly into place echoed like a terrifying gunshot in the confined subterranean space, completely sealing my terrifying fate in the room. He casually pocketed the heavy iron key, his dead, unblinking eyes finally locking directly onto my violently shivering, soaking wet form huddled helplessly in the deep shadows of the corner. He immediately began stalking toward me with slow, purposeful strides, his massive hands reaching out greedily as he systematically cornered me against the damp, moldy ceramic wall of the abandoned shower area. I pressed my bare back so hard against the freezing tiles that it physically hurt, frantically scanning the small dressing room space for any possible escape route or improvised weapon to defend my life. There was absolutely nothing around me except an overturned, rotting wooden bench and a small, heavily rusted ventilation grate located far too high up near the ceiling for my small hands to reach. Dom quickly closed the remaining harrowing distance between us, his massive, looming shadow entirely engulfing my small frame and plunging me into complete and utter darkness. He reached out his thick, callous right hand directly toward my exposed shoulder, his breathing becoming incredibly heavy and dangerously erratic as he smiled down at me with malicious intent. I tightly squeezed my eyes shut, curling into a tiny, helpless ball and bracing myself for the terrifying, inevitable physical impact of his rough grasp upon my bare, wet skin. Just as his thick fingers finally grazed my shivering shoulder, an incredibly aggressive, overwhelmingly loud buzzing noise suddenly began vibrating violently from inside the hollow wooden slats of the wall directly beside my head. The entire wooden paneling began to bulge and warp outward as the intense, demonic buzzing sound escalated into a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the small dressing room. The sudden chaotic roar of the vibrating wall completely drowned out the terrified gasp that forcefully escaped my burning lungs as I stared upward in sheer disbelief at the buckling wood. Dom violently stumbled backward in sudden surprise, wildly swatting his massive hands at the empty air as a few angry yellow insects shot out from a visible crack in the splintering wood. Suddenly, the rotting wooden wall panel violently cracked completely open from the inside pressure, releasing a furious, swirling dark cloud of hundreds of massive, angry wasps straight into the locked concrete room. The massive, hulking predator instantly dropped to his knees, screaming in agonizing, blinding pain as he desperately clawed at the aggressive, stinging cloud, momentarily forgetting the terrified child he had just successfully cornered. Seizing my only desperate, fleeting chance at survival, I dropped low to the floor and began crawling frantically through the swarming, venomous chaos toward the locked exit, my terrified eyes locked entirely on the heavy iron key that had miraculously fallen from Dom's thrashing pockets. My fingers scraped against the cold, damp tiles as I lunged for the heavy iron key lying near Dom's boots. Above me, the air was thick with the rhythmic, angry hum of thousands of wings. Dom let out a guttural scream as the first wave of wasps descended upon his exposed neck. I grabbed the key, the cold metal biting into my palm with the sense of sudden, violent hope. The predator was now the prey, his massive frame stumbling backward into the lockers. Yellow and black bodies pelted the walls like rain, a living carpet of venom and rage. I didn't look back as I scrambled toward the heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. My breath came in ragged gasps that tasted like copper and old dust. I felt a sharp, searing heat on my shoulder as a stray wasp sank its stinger into my skin. Ignoring the fire in my nerves, I shoved the key into the rusted lock with all my strength. Dom's heavy footsteps thudded behind me, though they were clumsy and erratic now. The lock groaned, resisting my small hands as the swarm grew louder and more frenzied. I could hear him sobbing and cursing, the sound muffled by the drone of the insects. Finally, the mechanism clicked and the heavy door swung open just a few inches. I squeezed through the gap, the rough wood scraping against my chest as I forced my way out. I found myself in a dark storage area smelling of chlorine and wet concrete. Behind me, I heard Dom throw his weight against the door I had just escaped. I looked for a way to bar the door, my eyes scanning the shelves for anything heavy. I grabbed a heavy metal pole used for cleaning the pool and jammed it into the handle. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the hum of the pool filters. Then the scratching started, the sound of fingernails digging into the wood from the other side. I knew the pole wouldn't hold for long against his manic strength. I turned and ran deeper into the storage maze, tripping over a stack of plastic chairs. My knees hit the concrete hard, sending a jolt of fresh agony through my body. I saw a small, high window that led to the outside world, a rectangle of moonlight in the dark. I began to pile the plastic chairs, stacking them precariously to reach the ledge. The door behind me buckled, the metal pole groaning under the pressure. I climbed the shaky tower of chairs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The top chair shifted, nearly sending me tumbling back into the darkness. My fingers finally found the edge of the windowsill, the cold stone giving me something to hold on to. With a final heave, I pulled myself up, my legs kicking at the air as I tried to find leverage. A hand suddenly grabbed my ankle, a massive bruising grip that threatened to pull me back. I kicked out wildly, my heel connecting with something soft and yielding with a sickening thud. Dom let out a howl of pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to slip free. I threw myself through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the wet grass outside. The cool night air hit my lungs, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the locker room. I didn't stop to rest, pushing myself up and running toward the distant lights of the main road. Every shadow seemed to stretch out like a reaching hand, chasing me through the dark. Even now, years later, the sound of a buzzing insect makes my skin crawl and my heart stop. But as I reached the road and looked back, I realized the nightmare wasn't over. I had left something vital behind in that room. That lingering sense of unresolved terror from my own childhood escape perfectly mirrors the nightmare 4 college girls faced years later. The surface of the water rippled violently as the lead intruder stepped closer to the edge of the pool. We huddled together in the deep end, our teeth chattering from both the cooling air and the raw fear coursing through us. The tallest man spat on the concrete and demanded to know where Sarah's boyfriend was hiding. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice was a thin, broken reed that the wind instantly carried away. He chuckled softly, a sound that felt like sandpaper against our exposed skin. The second man, shorter and broader, pulled out a thick leather folder and tossed it onto a glass patio table. He explained that they were debt collectors, but their methods were clearly far from legal. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I realized they wouldn't leave until they got what they came for. The lead intruder paced the perimeter of the pool, his heavy boots thudding rhythmically on the stone tiles. "Please, we don't know where he is," Sarah pleaded while her knuckles turned white against the pool wall. "Don't lie to me, little girl." The tall one barked as he kicked a decorative chair into the water. The splash was deafening, sending a wall of chlorinated water over our heads and soaking the men's trousers. The lead intruder wiped his face, his expression shifting from amusement to cold, calculating rage. We were trapped in a blue-tiled cage, vulnerable and barely dressed, while they held all the power. "Give us the keys to the house," he demanded, reaching out a hand toward the edge of the pool. I felt the cold creeping into my bones as the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving me shivering. I glanced at the sliding glass door leading into the kitchen, wondering if we could make a run for it. But one of the men stood directly in front of the door, leaning casually against the frame with a heavy metal pipe. Sarah started to sob, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the courtyard. "Shut her up," the tall intruder hissed, pointing his finger at me like a loaded gun. I reached out and grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her closer to try and muffle her cries. The lead intruder knelt down, his face now only inches from the water's surface. He told us that if we didn't cooperate, he would start throwing the outdoor electronics into the water with us. The realization of what that meant, electrocution, sent a fresh wave of panic through the group. He then grabbed a heavy glass lantern from the table and held it over the water's edge. "Where is the money, Sarah?" he asked again, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I don't have it. He left last night," she screamed, her voice cracking with exhaustion. The man stood up abruptly and kicked the folder into the pool, the papers fluttering like dying birds before hitting the surface. I watched as the ink on the documents began to bleed into the blue water, turning it a murky gray. The third man, who had been silent, pulled out a pocket knife and began cleaning his nails with terrifying nonchalance. Every second felt like an hour, and the cold was now causing my muscles to cramp painfully. I noticed a heavy golf club leaning against the side of the house, left there from earlier in the day. I began to drift slowly toward that side of the pool, trying not to make a single ripple. The intruders were distracted, arguing among themselves about whether to go inside the house or stay out here. One of my friends, Amy, whispered my name, her eyes wide with a warning. I ignored her and kept moving, my fingers finally brushing the cold stone of the edge. Suddenly, the lead man turned back toward us, his face contorted in a mask of pure violence. "Enough of this," he roared, reaching for the heavy outdoor lamp once more. I realized I had only seconds to act before he carried out his lethal threat. As his hand closed around the lamp's base, I lunged out of the water, reaching for the only weapon I could find. Kelly's hand closed around the heavy ceramic base of the table lamp just inside the sliding glass door. With a guttural scream of pure adrenaline, she swung the lamp with all her might into Chad's smirking face. The ceramic shattered into 1,000 shards, spraying dust and sharp fragments across the patio stones. Chad let out a high-pitched, bellowing cry as blood began to seep through his fingers. He stumbled backward, tripping over a folded patio chair and crashing onto the grass. Kelly didn't stop to admire her work. She dove back into the house toward the hallway closet. She emerged seconds later wielding a heavy metal golf club left behind by a boyfriend. I used the distraction to lunge out of the pool, my wet skin sliding over the plastic rim. I landed hard on the grass, the impact knocking the wind out of me for a brief second. Brad tried to move toward me, but Kelly charged at him with a scream that sounded like a war cry. She swung the metal club down, and a sickening thwack echoed as it connected with Brad's forearm. Brad howled in agony, his arm going limp as he retreated toward the back gate. "Help, call the police," I screamed at the top of my lungs, my voice cracking with terror. A light flickered on in the Petersons' house next door, followed by the sound of a heavy door slamming. Vlad, who was still holding Claire by the hair near the pool, looked around in a panic. Dana and I scrambled to our feet, grabbing heavy glass cocktail jars from the pool ledge as makeshift weapons. Seeing his friends already fleeing, Vlad shoved Claire away and bolted for the wooden fence. Just as he reached the gate, Mr. Peterson burst through from the other side, looking like a giant in the dark. Behind him was his friend, an off-duty officer who didn't hesitate for a single second. The officer tackled Vlad into the grass, pinning him down with a clinical, crushing efficiency. Claire collapsed into the grass, sobbing hysterically as Dana and I rushed to her side. Chad and Brad had vanished into the darkness of the suburban streets, leaving a trail of blood and shattered glass behind. Within 10 minutes, the entire block was illuminated by the strobing red and blue lights of police cruisers. We sat wrapped in heavy towels on the back porch, giving our statements to a grim-faced detective. Vlad didn't stay silent for long. He quickly ratted out his friends in exchange for a lighter sentence. It turned out they were indeed college students, but their debt collection was a rogue operation for a local dealer. Chad's face would never be the same. A jagged, permanent scar from the lamp would mark him forever. They were expelled from the university immediately and faced a laundry list of felony charges. Their wealthy families managed to keep them out of prison, but their reputations were utterly destroyed. We stayed in that house for another 6 months, but none of us ever felt comfortable in the yard again. In a twist of fate, Kelly and Pete didn't break up over the danger his lifestyle had caused. They eventually got married and transformed their lives, both becoming dedicated nurses in the city. Dana and Claire drifted away as we graduated, the shared trauma eventually becoming too much to talk about. I still think about that night whenever I see a backyard pool reflecting the setting sun. It serves as a reminder that even in our safest moments, shadows can emerge from the edge of the forest. Kelly and I are still friends, and we often joke that her golf swing saved our lives that day. The pool nightmares of my youth are finally behind me, replaced by the quiet routine of a normal life. I never became a swimmer, preferring the safety of the dry land and locked doors. But I learned that when you're pushed into a corner, you find a strength you never knew you had. Our attackers are gone, and we are finally truly free from the shadows of that summer night.